Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fourth Global Archaeology, African Archaeology at Home and in the Diaspora. And today's discussion and roundtable conversation is on archaeological science in Africa and the diaspora, the present situation and future prospects. I just once again like to thank the Oxford Africa Initiative, the Oxford Centre for Humanities, the School of Archaeology and St. Cross College Oxford for sponsoring these webinars, and just to remind you all that these are co-hosted by the Universities of Oxford, Cambridge, Cape Town, and Great Zimbabwe in partnership with the Pan-African Congress for Prehistory and Related Studies, the Society of Black Archaeologists, Sapiens, the Society of Africanist Archaeologists, and the Benegren Foundation. So this afternoon, we have at least 6 speakers, but Thomas Klondlana, we're hoping is going to join us at some point. He's having a few connectivity issues. And as I mentioned, the issue we really want to dig down into is how do we make archaeological science on the African continent more sustainable, more equitable? How do we avoid parachute science, which if you've been following the SAFA listserv recently, there's been some discussion about that. How do we find funding for African scholars, in particular for the dating of their archaeological sites, for funding other kinds of archaeology? And how do we create a new generation of African archaeological scientists? So to kick off, it's a delight to have Tunde Babalola, currently a SMUTS fellow at the University of Cambridge, to answer or explore, first of all, what do you think, Tunde, can be done to develop archaeological science in Africa? And more generally, do you think everyone on the continent should be doing archaeological science?
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Lin, for the introduction and for inviting me to this webinar. And also thank you, Professor Shikuri, and all the sponsors and the colleagues here. I so much appreciate the invitation. I think in terms of doing archaeological science, there is when we talk about decolonization, there is a different, levels of decolonization that we have to do. Number one thing that I think we have to do is to, first of all, decolonize the term itself, archaeological science. Because at times, when we say archaeological science, most colleagues on the continent, and more importantly, students, they feel like, oh, it's something big, it's something that is outside what they should think about, because, this is archaeology. This is Africa, rather. We don't have, the lab, we don't have the equipment, so why should I think of archaeological science when I don't even have access to the lab and the equipment I need to do such? So I think, first of all, it is our responsibility to make sure that we deconstruct the term archaeological science. So at times, it's a very big word, and at times could be very vague. And obviously, many people think about, when you say archaeological science, you only talk about DNA, genomes, you talk about osteology and all these big archaeological science things. And in the real fact, you can actually set up some basic archaeological science research that does not really require all those big, laboratory equipment and the big funding. For example, we have a couple of students, thinking about a very fantastic research that will have been, that will have fit well into archaeological science project. But because they feel like, oh, this is not laboratory based, I don't have the right equipment, they don't really talk about that. For example, I think doing the research on just, categorizing ceramic, paste from late Bronze Age versus early Bronze Age, using just lens to look at the paste and the inclusions. That is archaeological science to me. And there are many times, but students may think, or colleagues on the continent, that, oh, that does not fit into the big theme of archaeological science. So I think we need to get that straight. And then that takes me to the next point that I would like to talk about, which is decolonizing science laboratory itself. Because many colleagues on the continent, when they talk about science laboratory, they think about multi-million laboratory in Europe or North America with huge spaces. And in the actual fact, we can actually do a lot, not necessarily by being within a very huge space and having the huge machine, in front of you. So I think we also have to get it straight that when we say archaeological science, we don't necessarily mean being within a very huge, laboratory space confronted by, huge machine, that does all this work for you. However, I'm not ruling out the fact that the space is necessary, the equipment is also necessary. And I think another point that I will like to touch on quickly is the issue of genuine collaboration. So for us to develop archaeological science in Africa on the continent, we need to have what I call genuine collaboration. This is not a collaboration just for the sake of having Africans' name on your publication. It's not collaboration for just, for you to have a free pass for the administrative work on the continent or in the country you are working, but collaboration that takes the need of the African country you are working in into the planning of your research, right from the planning stage to the stage of grant proposal writing. So we should be concerned about the needs of the African institution on the African continent. So what can we give them to help them develop their laboratory facilities? For example, we have the radiocarbon dating in Dakar. It's been there for so long. For many years it was not functioning, and I think recently it was renovated and functioning at a very low capacity. Imagine if all the Africanists in the West working in Senegal, for example, they make it a priority to renovate that lab and make that lab really functioning. It will revolutionize archaeological science on the West African, sub-region, for example. Think about lowering the cost of having to send your radiocarbon sample to the US or Oxford in the UK or South Africa. And then number two, think about serving the West African region if that lab in Dakar is well functioning, and also thinking about improving the quality of work that colleagues on the continent we have opportunity to be able to do. So I think, and then lastly, just in 30 seconds, I would also like to mention what I called transoceanic mentorship. One thing that we've gotten out of COVID is exactly what we're doing now. So we can mentor, early scholars in Africa, so PhD students in Africa via Zoom, Skype, and help them, think through their design. Think through their research design and their projects. I think I will stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tunde. And just to remind everybody who's listening, that you're welcome to send in comments and questions via the chat facility that you have available to you. I see that Thomas Tondlana has managed to reconnect with us. So welcome, Thomas. And I'm delighted that you're here. And we appreciate you have to keep your camera off. So can I just ask you what, in your view, why has archaeological science been slow to take off in most parts of Africa? Obviously, there are examples like Cape Town, where there's a very strong tradition, but in many other areas, there isn't.
Okay. How many minutes do I have, Paul? Sorry. Hello,
5.
Paul. 5. Okay,
5
thank you
minutes,
very much.
5 minutes, Thomas.
Okay, thank you. I'm happy to be with you today and really excited that I'm part of the conversation. Sorry for the delays. I'm also happy to be alongside Marcos and Shadrach, who happen to be my supervisors at master's and PhD level Having said that, I think the reason why archaeological science has been slow to take off in Africa is the issue to do with geographical disparities that we have, where we find that in North America and Europe, these have become powerhouses of archaeological science. Maybe the first barrier has to do with institutional arrangements in Africa, where we usually have archaeology as an appendage of history. So archaeology is firmly embedded in history to the extent that most institutions don't attract people who have got a hard sciences background. So that's sort of different when it which transferred from the Faculty of Arts and went to the Faculty of Science. So I think that's one of the issues there. Then secondly, I think issues to do with laboratories. We don't have laboratories. Laboratories are very critical, a very critical space when it comes to knowledge production in archaeological science. So we find them in wealthier nations. You're talking of Britain, China, Japan, and the US. So when it comes to poorer nations, we have survived on other institutions, particularly UCT, which has given us a sanctuary to do archaeological science. So most Africans are quite frustrated. You talk of, in my own area of expertise, archaeometallurgy, people like Herman Kriyama and Edwin Okafor have since went to other disciplines like heritage management, simply because they can't access laboratories. And then thirdly, I also think that we don't have access to scientific publications in archaeological science. For example, your Archaeometry and the Journal of Archaeological Science, our libraries can't pay the acquisition to subscribe to those journals. So I think, in short, that would be my answer to your question, Paul.
Thanks very much, Thomas. So really, I think the issue about sort of much of archaeology is sort of being sort of, forged initially in history department is a point that's very well made. But if you think about the history of archaeological science in the West, that began with archaeologists beginning to have conversations with people, non-archaeologists in their labs, and maybe thinking about how we can foster those conversations more would be something we can explore in the chat, in the discussion and the Q&A. But brilliant, really apposite points that you've made, Thomas. Thank you. Chioma, I'm going to move on to you if you're okay with that. What challenges do you think are associated with developing archaeological science, particularly in Nigeria, where you are now, but in any other African country?
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so delighted to be here to speak on this topic, archaeological science. So I could begin by saying that in Nigeria, let me use Nigeria as a reference point, the history of archaeological science is relatively recent, because in the 1940s, 1950s and 60s and all that, most of the archaeological research that we are being conducted, from my readings, but I stand to be corrected, have focused more on retrieving of archaeological, the material remains, and using those remains to reconstruct the cultural history of the region or the people, as the case may be. But as time goes on, there is need to involve more things, more technological advancements of archaeological science, looking at radiocarbon dating, archaeobotany, zooarchaeology, and archaeometallurgy, and all that, going further ahead. But I could say that from my experience and being in Nigeria for so many years, the main thing that is a challenge, which Tunde has also pointed out, is lack of infrastructure, lack of equipment. Take for instance, we have over 150 universities, both privately owned, state and federal university. And out of those universities, out of the 150, we have about 7 to 10 that are offering archaeology, so to speak. But you find that in those universities, apart from Ibadan, I don't know much about ABU or other ones, but apart from Ibadan, I know that they have a lab. I've not been there, I've not seen it, but I don't know how well equipped it is. So, but basically, we don't have the lab. The laboratory is very, very important. And as a result of that, we have very poor staff because they are not well trained. They don't have the training to really know how to go about doing archaeological science. Sometimes some people might endeavor to get out of the country to go to Europe to study archaeological science, but when they come back, they're still faced with the challenge, the same challenge of not having anything to work with. They don't have anything to work with. And before you know it, the skills and the expertise that they've gained during the period of their PhD or their master's, they can't use it. I know most archaeologists that I know that are in Nigeria, they have very good archaeological skills, but when you go to the field and you come back, you don't have how to, scientifically analyze your materials. It's quite challenging. There is no reference, detailed reference collections with regards to plant remains and all that. So it's quite a challenging thing. And some can say, oh, why not use other departmental laboratory, like for instance, go to botany to make use of their resources, maybe to analyze your pollen, but it's still ill-equipped. They don't really have that functional lab that you can use to work. So that's the major issue with regards to establishing archaeological research here. And I also think that the government also have a part to play, but in Nigeria, most people in power or in leadership don't really know much about archaeology, and they tend to focus more on tourism and development because it brings in more people. But as a government, I think there should be need for them to actually invest, because it's their duty to provide education to people, to provide facilities to universities. So I think they should also have a role to play by, contributing, establishing lab or buying one equipment or the other. And also very top organizations in African country can also come in to, help out to equip us with what we need in terms of infrastructure. So that's what I can say with regards to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Chioma. And I think you raise a really interesting issue to do with perception. I mean, I think about the sort of way in which archaeological science gets such good coverage in television programs and on the media. I mean, in the UK, I suppose a week ago or 10 days ago, like every single morning on the Radio 4 Today program, there was an archaeological story, and there was always archaeological science at the center of that. Maybe it was a slow news week, but nonetheless, it gives us that kind of coverage. And perhaps, Shadrach, something that we need to be thinking about as a future Globinar is media and that kind of popularization and what can be done in that respect. So Chioma, thanks so much for that. Mary, I'm going to shift to you if that's okay. And it's really picking up on much of the points that Chioma ended on, with the issues to do with what kinds of infrastructure are needed to do sustainable archaeological science, bioarchaeology, etc. in Africa, and what do you think the challenges are in terms of?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me here today. I think that in terms of infrastructure, we've been focusing so far on what Africa doesn't have, the big and quite expensive labs to do specialized analyses like ancient DNA, proteomics. And I think a couple ideas that we could explore are how to make the existing labs in the global north more accessible to African scholars so that you can work on your materials, right? But this has to be through funded visiting fellowships, right? It has to be through training and workshops on the continent. And it has to be, going back to a point that was made earlier, through true collaboration, right? Not simply adding people as co-authors, but starting at the idea stage and the proposal stage of collaborations with those existing labs. But maybe one thing we could discuss in the Q&A too is sort of a thought experiment about what it would take to build labs, major archaeological science labs on the continent, because there are successful models of this outside the global north. There's multiple ancient DNA labs, for example, that are being built outside of Europe and North America. And we can sort of think about not only what that takes in sort of in terms of funding, but also expertise. So a point that was raised earlier is about this sort of division between archaeology as history and in the humanities and then the sciences. And I think in order to have the kinds of integration of expertise that you need to run those labs, we do need to be bridging those fields. And the other thing I think we could talk about is what are some successful models for how to support African scientists? And I think that there's several out there, but H3 Africa is quite a good one. So this is the Human Heredity and Health Consortium. This is focused on genomics, and genomics is a different ballgame from archaeology in terms of funding and public interest. But I think that there are some important lessons that we could take away from what that consortium is doing that we could then maybe sort of leverage in our own existing professional organizations, or perhaps even a new professional organization devoted to archaeological science on the continent. But then I also want to talk about infrastructure that we already do have, right? Rather than only lamenting what we don't, and sort of refocus the conversation on museums. Because this is an area where Africa has quite rich collections, but still struggles with the same problems as museums everywhere in terms of a curation crisis and long-term funding to support those collections. And then we have to, I think if we're going to talk about decolonizing archaeological science, we have to talk about the fact that huge numbers of African collections, both cultural heritage and biological heritage in terms of human remains, are in the global north right now. They're in European museums, they're in North American museums, and that means that European researchers often have more access to those collections than African researchers do. And that's a serious issue that I think we can all take some sort of small steps at least to address. And then finally, in terms of thinking about expertise and training, I think there's quite a lot of expertise in African archaeology and in African archaeological science on the continent that's often overlooked and under leveraged. So African scholars are routinely undercited in the literature. I looked at some metrics, or I created some metrics the other day, for example, looking at the 6 major ancient DNA papers that were published on sub-Saharan Africa in the last 6 years. And you look at the authorship lists on those papers, and on average, African scholars are 14% of the authors. You could also look at training, you could look at PhDs. So I looked at the NSF database, and this is only for the United States, so the United States National Science Foundation, and only looking at scholars who would have had an NSF-funded PhD in the United States, so at a US institution. But of the 91 NSF-funded PhDs that I found on African archaeology, just 10 were done by African scholars, and 8 of those people were trained in the 90s. And so this brings me to my last point, which is that there's a generational gap here, and it's leading to a mentoring crisis in which there's relatively few people, and I'm speaking now from the United States perspective, relatively few people here training African students right now in archaeology, period, let alone in archaeological science. And so I think that's another major issue that we'll have to address. And I have some ideas about how maybe individual people, in this call can address these, but I'll leave that for the Q&A so that I don't take up too much time.
Thank you. Everybody's doing remarkably well. They're coming in under 5 minutes. What's not happening is the audience are not sending in, bombarding us with questions and comments. So please do. Otherwise, there'll be an awful, well, you'll just have to listen to us chat to each other instead. Thank you very much, Mary, for that, and picking up really on the issue of training, which actually leads very nicely and neatly into the question I had for Ashley Kutu. So you've had a role in offering training both in archaeological science in more formal contexts when you were at UCT, for example, but I know that you've also often done this in less formal contexts, either in the field and in the lab, a more hands-on experience, if you like. So how might we make such training in archaeological science, very much the point that Mary was making, more sustainable? And what role should institutions in the West be enabling? I mean, Mary flags up this interesting generational gap, and considerable investment in training African scholars in Western institutions, but then we send them back and we wash our hands of them, and we don't typically provide them with any subsequent support. And maybe you might have some thoughts about that. But anyway, nice to hear your views on it.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Paul. And yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's a real joy to be sitting in a virtual room with archaeological scientists who I greatly respect. And obviously all of you have also given such inspiring and thoughtful comments. I'm going to try my best to follow up on all of these really, really great points. So I was asked to think about training and thinking about how we move forward with training opportunities. But I think for me, there are kind of three strands of that, which we've all touched on a little bit. So it's a little bit of reiteration, but also maybe how we could think through these different strands. So for me, it's about networks and about people. It's about the infrastructure. So we've talked a lot about sort of labs and facilities. And then it's also about funding. And I put networks first because I think people are at the absolute heart of this. I think we need people talking to each other. We need to create career prospects and training for people. And that really comes through, for me, it's come through really good networks. And so as an example, when I was based in Cape Town, the Stable Isotope Lab, you know, not only has lots of people from all over the continent coming to, you know, work with their samples there, but we also had each year the Stable Isotope course, which drew, you know, many, many people, not just archaeologists, but we had, you know, ecologists and zoologists and wildlife forensic specialists and all sorts of people coming to take that course, but also all sorts of people coming to actually do analysis in the lab. And so, you know, it really for me was a hub of this particular technique, this particular method. And it drew, you know, all of those, you know, fantastic people from different disciplines. And that's really for me I think the relevance and the importance of archaeological science is that it is so interdisciplinary. So we do draw on so many different methods from different disciplines. And therefore those people who are in, you know, Chioma was just talking about the botany department and, you know, ecology departments and all of these different departments that archaeological science overlaps with. I think the networks of people that we can bring together in these sorts of training opportunities are absolutely key. Because just in the couple of years that I was involved in that course, I met, you know, so many people who I now am writing grant proposals with and who are, you know, involved in, particularly in their own institutions and trying to bring different departments together in their university. Because of this divide of archaeology being seen, you know, as history, as anthropology. And so I think for me that seeing that network where you've got a kind of hub where the method is being developed, but you've got a hub of lots of different people from different disciplines coming together has been incredibly fruitful. And so thinking about also what Mary said about, you know, different African scholars on the continent in these different sciences, you know, perhaps that's the network we also need to start drawing on a bit more, because the next point that I wanted to talk about with the infrastructure is, I think through my training opportunities, but also through training others, I've noticed that in many of the places I've worked, my students have pointed out that these labs do exist, you know, that a lot of this equipment, it may exist in, you know, very disparate labs across a university, or it may exist in government facilities, or it may exist in terms of private companies. But the equipment that's there, I think, is there and doesn't necessarily need to be the absolute state of the art, you know, best model, etc. It's about what Tunde was saying, you know, about taking the infrastructure that's there and just putting some money and thought into how do we develop this into a hub, say, of this is where, you know, radiocarbon dating for this region is going, you know, everything's going to be sent through this lab, and kind of creating these hubs across the continent, I think could be a really interesting way to think about it, because I completely agree with that idea that science is in this kind of white coat, very huge labs with also with completely, for me, it's a completely wasteful environment in many ways. When you think about all the kind of, single-use plastics and single-use, tubes and everything being pre-sterilized. And I mean, we don't actually need that. I've worked in so many labs where, you just use good old-fashioned glassware and you clean it, and you revitalize old equipment. I mean, it's, yeah, I think there is a kind of what am I trying to say, economy there as well, a sort of, science as waste, I suppose, which I would like to very much, avoid, I think, in thinking through building infrastructure. And then I've got 15 seconds left. I'm looking at my timer. So I think the last thing about funding that I just wanted to say is that I think in thinking about decolonizing, we're thinking about dismantling structures, and funding is a huge part of this, because the structures in place at the moment, I think often where we, our sort of typical sources of funding, especially in Europe and North America, don't often allow us, or at least the structures that are in place now, we have to be very creative about the way we develop funding and proposals in an equitable and collaborative way. And so I think there's also a lot that I'm sure many of the audience are involved in, either reviewing proposals or sitting on these funding, bodies, to think about how we might be more creative and about sort of how this funding is distributed to create this infrastructure and create these networks and these training opportunities, so that, for example, not 100% of the funding has to go to one institution, but that it's, spread between all of the co-Is, for example, on a project. So I think it's something that is a long-term development, but also something that each of us in our different roles can probably start thinking about with funding. And maybe we also need to be thinking outside of the box and thinking about private companies or other ways that we could, as Chioma mentioned, governmental funding, to raise awareness of the potential that's there and just needs to be activated, really. So I think it's exciting. It's hugely exciting. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ashley. And I think that one of the things that we're all taking away from the global pandemic is actually the potential that is out there for us to run workshops and training events and so forth. And it would be really interesting to hear from the audience if they think perhaps there would be a way in which collectively we could design either a MOOC or some other kind of accessible training in archaeological science, and run this on a regular basis online, but attract so to trying to address some of the perhaps the shortcomings or the capacity gaps in university staffing on the continent, to help fill gaps in the curriculum. But something to explore, I think. So Shadrach, our poster boy, perhaps. Excuse me from calling you that, but I know you well enough to know that you won't take offense, I hope. But you are, in some sense, a real success story. And so I'd be really interested to hear, I think, what fundraising strategies and collaboration may be required to establish archaeological science in Africa. And I have a supplementary question, if you like, is it just a question of establishing a fund to pay for the science, or do we need to do something a little bit more?
Thank you, Paul. The good thing about being asked a number of questions is that you just choose the easier one. So that's what I will do. But I would like to benefit from the very solid foundation which my colleagues have already laid out, which is, again, a benefit of coming towards the end, because all the good points will be taken. So all you just need to do is just to, it's a question of emphasis or elaboration. But perhaps I want to start off at what might be like a slight tangent, by saying that this issue of archaeological science is not just a challenge for Africa alone. It is a challenge for the entire world, for the entire globe, for the whole global community. The reason why I'm saying that is because of the secular nature of the economy, the way in which resources circulate and flow from one region of the world into the other, where you find that there are these resource extraction companies at work in Africa, and then headquartered in New York, in London, Shanghai, and all those places. So, what is their role in terms of funding or making funding available? We hear a lot about corporate social responsibility, ESG, environment, sustainability, and governance, and so on. But how much of that, you know? So Anglo-American, for example, a very big Billiton, one could also say, these are giant corporations working in almost every African country that has minerals. And why is it that the process of giving back through corporate social responsibility and so on has not reached archaeological science? So my answer to that is, as archaeologists working in Africa and outside, isn't it perhaps a time for us to reprioritize? So what are our research questions, right? Can I compete with a biochemist who is saying, let me, or a virologist who say, I want to develop a COVID vaccine? And then I say, hey, Paul, can we write a proposal to submit to De Beers so that we can redo the typology of Urewe, right? Who will get the funding? So there are some things that are foundational to our discipline, and I'm not trying to downplay their importance. They are very, very important in terms of foundational knowledge, but equally, there are other things that could also attract funding. So some of your own work, Paul, in terms of land use, working in terms of climate change, intersecting that with SDGs. That is the language. Those are the priorities. Even the people in other fields who are getting funding, they are speaking that language. It's a pity that the Global Challenges Research Fund, the funding has been reduced. But what are those challenges? You know, Urewe, I doubt very much it's on that priority. It's on that priority list, right? Why are we still making that our core business? So, if as long as it is our core business, we will struggle to raise funds locally. In Africa, there's also an emerging class of African billionaires, right? You know, the Philip Iheanachos of this world, who is this capitalist who is behind that Edo Museum of West Africa. And they are prepared to invest, right? But we have to make our priorities align with what the struggles of the everyday. And again, that has nothing to do with whether this is a hand X or a clever. You know, that's not, we don't eat that. So these are bread and butter issues. If you want money from the government, so you have a hospital without an ambulance, and you have archaeologists that are saying, well, we want to collect information on again, you know, typologies and so on. It doesn't add up. The sums don't add up. But I don't want to make everything too much in terms of relevance, benefit, and so on. But just to say that is a point that we sometimes forget. The issue of interdisciplinary collaborations within African institutions was emphasized, and we can also collaborate with academies such as the Academy of African Science, the Academy of Science of South Africa. There are also specialists, some of whom are part of that H3H platform which Mary was talking about. Then the other issue is that, is it possible to donate equipment? You know, Mary, you have your lab, and that microscope, you no longer use it. How about donating it to Shadrach? You know, it will work. You know, at least you can demonstrate teaching. Do we think of those? Yes, there are maintenance costs, I understand, but there are these small things, and perhaps much more in terms of what is challenging is that there are American universities, for example, that are setting up schools in Kenya. So it could be Fora School, and why are they not setting up a DNA lab there, or in Ethiopia? Or there are these campuses. The Harvard has a campus in Johannesburg, right? So why are they not setting up campuses and investing these resources? But this cycle of flows that I was talking about, it gets repeated. So to wrap off, you mentioned the issue of having a fund that is perhaps centrally administered and to be dedicated for multiple uses, which could be development of archaeological science or refurbishing the laboratory in Dakar, as Tunde was suggesting. I think such a thing could be quite helpful. But how do we teach these Africans to be a fisherman, right? And not to give them fish? How do we do that? Because that is also one of the major challenges, which also speaks to sustainability. So at the end of the day, I guess what everyone was saying is that there is no formula for this. There's no script. So what we can do is to combine these multi-pronged strategies, combine them, deepen our collaborations, have moments of reflection to say, if I am an archaeologist who have had the privilege of working since the 1960s or 50s and has built a personal collection of objects in my house, right? How will that help to develop archaeological science in the continent, right? So that's the reverse of what you were talking about, Mary. There's material which is in the north, there's material which is in the south, but some of it is in Shadrach's house. The good thing is that I don't have a house, and let me end here.
Okay, thank you very much, Shadrach. Before we just go to Marcus Martin Torres, who's very kindly agreed to try and sort of sum up and share his own thoughts. I understand some of you may be struggling to find where to submit questions. So there should be a hat box either to the right of the video or just below the video. You can use that. The organizers at Africa Oxford Initiative has also just set up a Slido, sli.do, in case you want to send questions anonymously, and it's participant code 648552. But we are beginning to get a few more questions coming in. So Marcus, over to you.
Well, again, thank you very much for having me. I'm very privileged to be a part of this group. Though when I was invited, I wasn't told I was going to be the one asked to summarize all of the many diverse and really important points that have been made. So I will try, but of course, inevitably, some will be lost just by my inability to encapsulate all of them, or perhaps my own biases. And I may also, throw in some of my own thoughts. So all I can say really is that I thoroughly agree with everything that has been said. But just to recap a few points under various categories, one of the strands that have been mentioned is that of people, as Ashley was saying, and the individual interactions that we all have. And I think this is important because we can keep blaming the system or just seeing a problem that's very big, but we need to deal with things one by one. And I strongly believe in the ripple effect of individual interactions. And in events like this, hopefully we are extending our individual commitment to uphold ourselves and those working with us to higher standards. And that involves, as many of you were saying, those true, genuine collaborations where we listen to and engage with the concerns and the research interests, not just the needs, but I would argue that the actual interests of people who may come from different academic or cultural backgrounds and may simply be interested in researching other things. And that is something that I think we have to be more open to, and that, you know, hopefully progressively will create a ripple effect. We've talked about infrastructure and associated to that funding. That inevitably is a big component of the problem. And but there have been, you know, some ways forward have been suggested. As you mentioned, not all of the science has to be so expensive. And I think sometimes we get a bit complacent by saying, but it is impossible to set up science laboratories in these less wealthy nations. And that is not true. As several of you were saying, there are a lot of things you can do cheaply. And nowadays you can set up sample preparation and microscopy and even chemical analysis and loads of other things that we get for our laboratories here. We get portable equipment that we bring with ourselves to Africa. Maybe we should think about actually creating those facilities in Africa for us when we go, but also for others, of course, for the local stakeholders. And this is something we should perhaps commit a bit more strongly to doing, rather than saying it is impossible. Most of the science that we do in the North is actually, I mean, it's of course expensive, but it's not within, you know, it's not outside the reach of some of the museums and archaeology or other departments in the global South, if we were to commit to support them, not just by, of course, throwing money at it, but also providing support and training. And this is, of course, the other challenge here, which has been raised, how to provide training and mentorship that is sustainable, and that is not just about, you know, either bringing African students for a short course or in the best case a degree, but then sending them off with no further support, or even worse, just turning up as you do your field project or your lab project or your sample collection in Africa, and you stop for a couple of afternoons to give a talk in a local school, and you think your job is done. Of course, we need something that is more meaningful and more robust. And again, there may be an element of personal commitment here, given that there is no legal formal expectation that we do that. I think personally we should commit more strongly in terms of an actual percentage, perhaps, of our time or our funding spent on a particular project, continent, region, to devote it to actually develop sustainable training and or infrastructure, in discussion, of course, with local stakeholders. In talking about funding, I think there are issues here, and both have been mentioned. One is government funding and how you persuade your own governments that what you do is relevant, that what you do is better than biomedicine or tourism. And I think that's something where, you know, I think it applies to most nations to different extents, but it's something that, again, with mentorship and engagement among all of us, we could perhaps help as well raise awareness of the significance of the humanities in general and archaeological science in particular in all nations. Another issue that was raised that I think it might be interesting to follow up is the possibility of private corporate funding. Chandler was talking about the corporate social responsibility money that, for example, mining companies have, and some of us here around this table know and have indeed used funding from these to support archaeological science projects and studentships in particular. But this is not completely uncontroversial, as we know, taking the money from some of these big corporations, which is something we might want to consider. Let me see what else I have here. I think, you know, there's been various examples of good practice mentioned here that I will not reiterate again, but I think there are examples to which we can refer, and so we need to use those and see how we can perhaps scale things up. There were a couple of things that I was thinking I would add that perhaps weren't mentioned. One is the peer review for grants. I mean, we talk about, yes, that, you know, there have to be stakeholders from local communities, etc. What I never see, and perhaps we should request that that is the case, those of us who find ourselves in peer review panels for grants, you rarely find a person from the countries of reference or even the region of reference. So it is easy enough to find an African stakeholder to stick their name on the application, but then those reviewing those applications for funding are usually those in the global north. At least those are the ones I find, the ones that effectively provide the funding and saying, yes, this is a project that's good enough to be funded and enabled. And maybe we should do more to have local stakeholders assessing the projects themselves. And then perhaps the final issue that I would raise, there are many more, but so I don't take up the time now, and we can then discuss whatever people want to discuss, was that of, once again, the funding, and more broadly, the extent to which we can commit as individual researchers and mentors at various scales to actually effect change. I strongly believe, and the question that I was set out to address was, you know, is there a way out of scientific colonialism? I certainly and very strongly believe yes, or at least I refuse to believe that there's, you know, that the answer cannot be any different from that. And I also believe strongly in the power of us in our individual interactions, in the individual networks, to actually act morally. But of course, we can also try to push our governments and those who have actually the power, or the institutions who have the power to effect change on a faster scale, if you like. And something that I thought might be worth discussing is whether we could, if not enforce, at least suggest a more formal commitment whereby a percentage of our investment in these research, archaeological science or otherwise research projects in less wealthy nations is actually devoted to be invested in developing capacity there, whether in the form of training or in the form of infrastructure. And I'm not saying this would be easy, but in the same way as we easily add overheads to our grants that are just a percentage of the overall budget, perhaps we should think of a form of engagement, or out there called reparation, in terms as explicit as that. So those are some of the salient points. There are, of course, many more. I've been really inspired by this conversation. So my apologies that my summary cannot really convey all of the interesting points that have been made, but I will leave it at this for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. I think you've captured a lot of really interesting and key issues that were emerging from this conversation. And I really like you ending on this question. Is there a way in which we can sort of leverage funds and you know, invest funds in training, you know, and have that as part of the funds that we apply for when we submit grants? I would love to see, and maybe one thing that could come out of this webinar today is some of us get together and with others and actually undertake an audit of both the resources that are available and also the needs that our colleagues on the continent really feel are pressing, both from a perspective of the teaching of archaeological science, but also its practice as well. You'll hear one of my cats getting in the background, getting noisy, so I may jump up and down to calm him down. But in the meantime, does anybody else want to come in? We've got a few minutes and then we will move on to some of the questions that we've received. Mary, you had a few comments that you thought you might be able to make in the Q&A.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, at this point, think most of them were made. I also, as Marcos was just saying, was thinking about, you know, we've been talking about big structural systemic change, but it happens through individual action. And so I had sort of like a 10-point list of things we could all do, but many of them have been said by now. You know, things that I think hadn't quite come up as much were, that I mentioned, were under citation, right? I think it's really important to cite African scholars because citation raises profiles and raised profiles lead to opportunities. And that's how you all of a sudden start a collaboration, right? Somebody knows about your work because it's been cited. So I think we need to be much more thorough about looking at our citations in our papers and making sure that we're citing relevant African work. Shadrach mentions collections in basements, and I mean, I think this is a real issue where we often, when we're seeking funding to do archaeological excavations, those of us who are from the global north, I think less and less, but historically have often exported collections for study at global north institutions, often not budgeting for the return of those materials when the project is over. I think that is starting to change. But I think that has to get budgeted into grant applications. And then I think, those of us who do peer review, right, Marcos was mentioning peer review, we have a lot of power to say this grant application is not accounting for these issues, or, this paper isn't citing this literature. So I think we have to really leverage the power and the privileges that we do have. And I guess the sort of last thing I wanted to say, my long list of sort of ideas of things we could do, is that when I look out and sort of see a lot of this is being done, who is sort of pushing for change, often it's our early career people. It's the graduate students, the postdoctoral fellows, people in lectureships, people who are under 40, right? And so I think, we who are, I'll speak for myself, we who are older than that need to, sort of support this younger generation by also making sure that we're, leveraging our relative positions of power to help support them and not sort of leave all of the work to the early career researchers.
Thank you, Mary. Do others here on the panel want to say anything that respond to any comments that have been made over the course thus far? Or Thomas, Marcus, yes.
Well, actually, Thomas has raised his hand. And
Thomas, yes. Tunde and Thomas then, yeah, thank you. So we'll go with Thomas first and then Tunde.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. I really wanted to say that when it comes to inequality access to archaeological science between the global north and the global south, I think we have to think in terms of funding opportunities, where if you think of major archaeological expeditions on the African continent, these are usually directed by international researchers. And I remember very well in the 1990s, Professor Ander was complaining that Africa was becoming a breeding ground for PhD students from Europe and North America in all social sciences and historical sciences. And these power structures in terms of knowledge production are still very real. We really feel them. We have scholars from the global north. We have got what we can say passport privileges, who can actually do parachute science. They come into Africa and they don't sort of build capacity amongst Africans. And then the other thing is that we are often kept in our perpetual childlike state as African archaeological scientists. You are second tier. In all the cases, you are regarded as second tier. So it's one of those things that I think has been we haven't been developing simply because we still remain in our shells as archaeological scientists. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. I think those are really important points. Tunde, do you want to say something, and then we can go to questions?
Yes, thank you so much. Shadrach mentioned a very important point by asking that how do we make Africans, teach them how to fish, not necessarily just dumping everything on them. And I think one point that I can't speak of other countries in Africa, but I think in Nigeria, for example, University of Ibadan was really well grounded in archaeological science. Actually, if you look at the history of the establishment of the department, it was initially established in the Faculty of Science, and it was later that, I think, if I'm right, it was later that it was, combined with art. So in Ibadan, for example, you can have combined degree in archaeology and geography and geology and botany and zoo. And at the same time, you can have combined degree in archaeology and history and plastic study at the same time. So I think for Nigeria, the foundation, is already kind of built, well built. But the issue, like I mentioned earlier, is how do we then transmit this, forward, in a sustainable way. We have students who are finishing from Ibadan, writing their thesis in the botany, for example, on botany related courses. Some writing on the geology related courses. So that expertise is there. But how do we now translate that in a kind of a very sustainable way? And I think that also connects with what most of us have been talking about in terms of, the real-time equipment, facilities, and the building capacity with international collaborators. And I will quickly say one thing about building research capacity, which I think Shadrach also mentioned, and asking Mary if she can donate her old microscope, to African institution. I think that is a very important point, which we all need to kind of consider. And I think I would like to mention that one thing that I think, in terms of a real-time action, so that we put what we preach into practice, I think that is really important. For me, 2019, I collaborated with Adisa Falakon from Obafemi University in Nigeria, and through my collaboration, we have a grant from Cambridge Africa Burada, and we're able to secure, 2 brand new microscopes for, the department in Ife with a computer, and the microscope, they both have a camera. So that is a kind of a small scale, contribution that we can make, not necessarily building the whole big lab, but at least they have those 2 sets of microscopes and their staffs can work with that. So we're doing the same thing with University of Nigeria in Nsukka, collaborating with Dr. Kingsley Jimba to provide them with 3 brand new microscopes and also a computer system. And this microscope also have a camera, so they can easily work with that. So that is the kind of bottom up, active contribution that I think we should be thinking of. And perhaps, like Marcus said, we should think of how we can incorporate such, into our budget when we apply for grants. Thank you.
Thank you, Tunde. The questions are coming in quick and fast here, and so we've got about half an hour, 25 minutes to go. Actually, the first question is one that maybe you can answer, Tunde. It was the very first question we got, and it's an interesting one. Is there a lasting legacy of the experimental archaeological reserve that Thurston Shaw established in the 1970s in the outskirts of Ibadan? I mean, because what Thurston had in mind was precisely creating an on the doorstep sort of location where you could practice archaeological science in a way. Whatever happened to that?
Thank you so much, Paul. I think that's an interesting question. So for me, to the best of my knowledge, the experimental, so to speak, work that I know about in Ibadan, I think was established in Haiti, somewhere in Haiti, which is on the outskirts of the University of Ibadan. And I think there was an experimental archaeological work going on there for a while, up to maybe late 80s or early 90s, as far as I know, which I don't think is still ongoing currently. So why that is not currently being, functional, I have no idea. Maybe it has to do with local interest. Maybe it has to do with local expertise. Maybe it has to do with also location, and perhaps the lifespan of that experimental work. I can't really speak to that, but I know that I don't think it's still ongoing, and I don't really know why it's really not functional at the moment. But I think that's one of the things that we also have to kind of think of how to bring back and how we can resuscitate such a good initiative.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think we shouldn't forget just the major impact of all of the structural adjustment programs had on African economies in the 80s and 90s. I remember arriving to teach in Dar es Salaam. It was extremely challenging, and at that point they were just getting out of it. There was beginning to be a sort of some liberalization of the economy and a shift in the thinking of the World Bank and so forth. So those days might be behind us, but they certainly had a very significant impact many are still living with today. Which sort of comes to the second question. The second question is, and anybody can chip in, just in terms of a ballpark figure, what would it take to set up a standard lab? How much would it cost? I guess that question is, contingent on what you want to do. Any thoughts? Anybody would like to suggest something? Yeah, go ahead, Marcus, please.
I'm not going to come up with a figure, so sorry to disappoint whoever is asking, because of course, as you were saying, it depends on what you want to do. But I would rather stress what Tunde was saying earlier, that you don't need to say, let's build a lab here. All you need to say is, we could so well do with a microscope here. Oh, we could really bring a portable XRF here. Oh, we could actually create a corner for a wet lab here so we can prepare our own samples, even if we then send them for a mass spectrometer somewhere else, which can still be within Africa. And those things, they do not really cost that much. And I would go further than, I totally understand the spirit of what Shadow was saying earlier, send us your old microscope. And that certainly is better than nothing, but it doesn't need to be always the old microscope. Why can't it be a new microscope if we are engaging and working with them? Why should we perpetuate the idea that a not so good enough microscope is good enough elsewhere? I think we need to think a bit more radically, and I think it's high time we do, and we can do it individually. And it's not expensive to buy a microscope. We all know the size of the budgets of the projects that some of us run. They are obscene, and a microscope costs, as very less than 0.1% of some of these projects' budgets.
Thank you. Ashley.
Can I just say quickly also that I think this connects to Mary's point about museums, because museums are, I think, also really key in terms of thinking about how, when we come from the field and the deposit of materials, but also the way that, that we all collaborate in field work, and then what happens to those samples, what happens to that knowledge from the field work. And those spaces, as Marcos was saying, could be very easily set up as these things are kind of coming in and being processed, or with the collections that are already in these museums that haven't been, studied in these ways. So there could be some really, I guess, quite simple, things that we could think through on an individual basis about just individually the museums that we work with on our fieldwork projects, and what is that piece of kit that everyone seems to use, or that everyone, if it was physically there, it would be, fantastic for training and all sorts of other opportunities.
Mary, you have your hand up.
Yeah, and just to respond to what Ashley said as well, I think, the National Museums of Kenya is a really excellent example of this, where, they've said, yes, we have these incredible collections. You want to work on them? You can do so here. And, you're going to need this equipment, and then that equipment, gets built, and then it's accessible to everybody at the museum. So there's certainly a model there for that. And I think, museums can take a very strong role in this, and saying, you're welcome to work on our collections. We're going to expect this, this, and this. In order for you to have that privilege. That's not what I was going to say. I was going to say, speaking as a person who, until January of this year, I never once had access to a lab, right? I've never had a lab. So I don't have any of this stuff, unfortunately, although now I guess I'll inherit some old microscopes. But, I think there is an alternate way to do archaeological science without access to a lab. And in my personal experience, that was through leveraging networks. And so we have to think about how to create an opportunity for those networks to form, and in ways where there is true, as people have been saying, genuine collaboration, and where African scholars are saying, I want to answer this archaeological question. I have access to these samples, or I want access to these samples, and I need a lab to partner with me, but I'm going to take the leading role as the PI in this. And I think that's the kind of energy that we need to sort of think creatively about how to create. And of course, it involves money, and that money could come from Global North labs who are paying for, as I said before, visiting fellowships and things. But you don't necessarily have to have the lab right there physically where you are to do the work. And I think increasingly we're seeing there's opportunities to do, as we're doing now, do a lot of this remotely.
Choma. Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Choma.
Yeah, just a quick one. To add up to what Marcus and Tunde has said in terms of donating of equipment. So I can also say that apart from donating equipment, we can also think of donating books. Like I could say that when I was in Cambridge, a lot of books were donated through my initiative. I had to go and meet a couple of lecturers, and I spoke to them. You see, we don't really have this type of books, this type of journal. My first time of seeing archaeological science journal was during my time in Cambridge. So I've never seen archaeological science journal, the hard copy, so to speak, not the e-copy. So it will also go a long way if people can donate books, donate journals, so that people in Africa can actually read through those articles, through the journals, and start thinking of doing similar research, and start learning from how things are being done to also do them here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are lots of comments coming up through and sort of some Fraser's questions, some as comments in about how to make archaeological science more attractive for the next generation outside of academia. What careers could those trained in these fields sort of go into? And that, in a sense, relates to a whole set of other comments and questions about how do you encourage greater collaboration and engagement between archaeologists in Africa and the scientists, the chemists, the physicists, the biologists, the metallurgists, the engineers who are who have perhaps resource labs that could be used. And again, it's really interesting comments are coming back to Ibadan and the sort of aspirations to establish an archaeological science frame to archaeology when it was set up. So just how do you are those conversations taking place for those of you who are based on the continent, but between archaeologists and chemists and physicists and biologists? If not, what are the things hindering those conversations? Shadrach.
Maybe I will give the most obvious example of the University of Cape Town, which by African standards is quite a very privileged institution, to the extent that people in the global north send their samples for strontium analysis and so on in Cape Town. But there we do have a very strong relationship with geology, with chemical engineering, as well as with mineral processing. So the key thing then is that what does science add to archaeology? To general archaeology, what difference does it make? So, which then takes us back to the issue of the questions that we are asking. So, to some extent, with perhaps pardonable exaggeration or maybe a hyperbole, if you may accept that, to some extent, archaeology in some parts of Africa has not moved on from the 1960s or from the 1970s. So, what sort of questions can you ask, right? And that's related to a host of all the other problems that you mentioned, Paul, like the issue of the economic structural adjustment programs and the effect on the lack of funding. So if the geology or the biology department has no microscope, as an archaeologist, who do you go to? That becomes one of those challenges. But nevertheless, things have improved in the recent years, such that I think that would be one of the most strategic things to do, to come up, frame questions that archaeological in nature, but that interests ecologists, right? That interests marine biologists. Then it means that when you do underwater archaeology, at least you are diversifying into other things, which then takes us to this vicious cycle that has been going on in African archaeology. And the question that I wanted to ask cheekily was that are Africans training themselves or others? You know, people who are based in Africa, are they training fellow Africans? Which might be, I accept, an unfair question to ask. But the reason why I would ask that question is that imagine I was trained in a history department, and in terms of traditional archaeology, if one may call it, and then I am told that he actually says, yeah, let us add isotope geochemistry to the curriculum. Where do I begin? I don't even know what an isotope is. You know, so it means that for me to be able to train the next person, I also need to get training myself. So do we need to start with from the basics, where we train the trainer? And when the trainer is trained, then that process and all these other interventions can come in, and then we can build these synergies in terms of you know, the other sister disciplines, chemistry and so on, because we know we can frame the questions and we know the revelations that we can get from science. So I tend to be very practical. So I tend to go for what one might call low-hanging fruits. What is the easiest thing that you can do with the least amount of effort? So that's why you can look for donations, you can crowd. What would be interesting is an experiment. When we go to Nairobi, Mary, can we do a crowd funding for microscopes? You know, just run a WhatsApp campaign and see how many shillings we can get. Can that be successful? These are some of the things which people are doing. I think let me end here.
I think when you do go, Shadrach, you should knock on the doors of the BIA, because there's a petrographic microscope there that I don't think has been used since Pete Robertshaw bought it with an NSF grant and brought it in, and Darla Dale worked on it, and subsequently, I know all the time that I was there as director, I was trying to find people who knew how to run it and so forth. So I hope it's not got be consigned to the junk heap, but maybe is sitting in some store somewhere in the BIA. We can ask Jane to hunt it down. Anybody that'd like to comment on Shadrach's observation? I've got a couple of questions here that I think would be nice. Mary, do you want to come in there or not?
I was just going to say Thomas has his hand up.
Oh, right. Okay. Thomas, do you have your hand up, or is that a legacy from earlier?
Yes, I had my hand up, Paul.
Okay, sorry. Right. Thank you. Please go ahead.
No, that's fine. Maybe I've often heard critics saying that archaeological science does lead to the dehumanization of archaeology. And others have also went to the extent of saying, well, maybe at the heart of the notion of archaeological science is this retreat from society. And in my own experience, you know, when you are trying to frame questions that really are in touch with African aspirations and national and continental priorities, you then tend to find that maybe themes in heritage management are much better than archaeological science. So maybe I would want to ask those who have been in the game for a long time, how can we be responsive to African challenges and realities? How can we avoid retreating from pressing issues in the African societies as archaeological scientists? What sort of questions should we be asking? Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. And that reflects a question that was was sent in. When there are so many other important challenges in many African countries, what's the point of investing in the heritage and the heritage science? I mean, I have certain views on that, but let's hear from others. Maybe Chioma, you've got some thoughts on that. Tunde, perhaps.
Okay, can I go? I think the honors, like Shadrach mentioned, lies in the hands of archaeologists who are based on the continent, and of course, archaeologists who are also outside the continent, in asking questions that are in tune with the current reality. For example, a lot of people have talked about decolonizing, archaeological curriculum. Some of archaeology offering universities across Africa are still using the curriculum designed in the 70s and in the 80s and for some in the 60s, which focus on just the traditional Stone Age archaeology. I mean, how do you table the issue of Stone Age, to Nigerian government, for example, when they have a lot of stuff that they are battling with? But I think when we start to think of how to speak, the contemporary language and how to contribute to the current, pressing issue, and of course, I think that's why many people see heritage studies and to some extent tourism, which I think are not really even in line with combining archaeology with tourism anyway. But of course, some people see it as a way of, boycotting the orders in traditional archaeology, as a way of reaching the government and also funding organization. So I think what we need to do is we need to start thinking of how do we get rid of this old package that we have archaeological question and the researches wrapped in, and now think of how to wrap it with a new form of dressing that will be more attractive, to people, that will be more attractive to students. Some archaeology departments in Africa don't even have enough students in the first place to train. So if you don't have enough students to train, then how do you even transmit, the knowledge? So I think for me, it is important that we start thinking of how to address, to speak to present issue locally before talking, thinking globally. Thank you.
Thanks, Tunde. A last word, Chioma, briefly.
Yes, so I think we need to start changing our perspective. Things are changing. The way things are 20 years ago, 30 years ago is different from the way things are at the moment. And when you look at some of the curriculum at the universities in Africa, it's still the same old things that people who were in the department 10, 20 years ago did, is what people that are currently in are still being taught. So we need to start thinking of how to diversify, how to make archaeology attractive, because here, most people, when you talk to them, when you tell them that, oh, I'm an archaeologist, or I do archaeology, the look on their face alone, they keep wondering, why do you have to go for archaeology? Why didn't you go for engineering or medicine or, some very disciplines? So we have to, so I think briefly that we just have to start from us, look at the curriculum, start thinking of how to bring in courses that can address present issues, so that when maybe you are talking to a governor or have an opportunity of talking to the Minister of Culture and Tourism or Minister of, you can be able to relate to him or her in the way she will understand. You can't go and tell you, oh, I want us to talk about Stone Age. Why do you want to talk about Stone Age? But if you can bring out Stone Age or archaeobotany in a way that is relatable to present day issues, you might get a listening ear. So So that's my take on that.
Thanks very much, Chilma. And that really sort of brings in a number of sort of questions that we've all been circulating around, and other people, but come up again that have been sent in. How do we best develop collaboration between archaeology departments and other kinds of departments on African universities? Do panelists know of how other departments, non-archaeological ones, have been able to leverage the funding for their equipment to these issues? And a request again coming back: can we have an audit of the resources and the African sort of archaeological scientists who are on the continent, who could work with projects and their various needs? And people making comments, what about writing archaeology books that highlight key findings and that address more popular audiences as well? I think these are all issues of extreme importance, and thank you to everybody for raising them. Just one last comment that I feel is also well worth making here is that we have a comment from somebody from Eastern Europe who points out that, of course, the global north is not homogenous in funding access, and they too can find a real struggle getting access to do the archaeological science that they work. So thank you for making that comment. So to all of our panelists, to our discussant Marcus, to all of you for listening to this webinar today, thank you all very much for coming. I'm sure we could continue discussions over a glass of something if that was possible. And hopefully we will be able to do it soon. So I'm going to hand over now to Tunde. But to everybody who's participated, thank you all very, very much indeed. It's been a stimulating afternoon. Shadrach.
Thank you so much. I think the message from here is that how do we keep making archaeological science cool? That would be cool, isn't it? But I think thank you so much for the conversations. These are continuing discussions, and our next webinar will be on the 21st of May, and it's entitled Co-Production of Knowledge and Community Engagement in Ethnoarchaeology and Archaeological Practice. So we will be building on from the issues that we were discussing. But there's also one event which might be of interest to our community, what is known as the Africa-Oxford Insakas. These are discussion forums that connects people working on Africa from different disciplines. But what is happening on the 6th of May is that there is Terry Odiaga, who is going to be talking about the Legacy Restoration Trust in Nigeria. And this relates to the return and restitution of the infamous or famous Benin bronzes. And she's going to be discussing the history of those bronzes. Are these calls for the return of the bronzes, are they new? Or it's something that was tried and tested before and failed. Will this fail again? These are some of the provocative questions that Terry will be engaging with on the 6th of May. So if you can you please tune in? So AFOX on the website, you will get the registration link. And with that, I may see you at the Inzaka, or otherwise the 21st, when we co-produce this knowledge, this archaeology from me and the others. Thank you so much for being with us. Enjoy your weekend.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.